rhetoric there, and that's one of the things that I enjoy watching it for, is to see how they're going to spin things.
Right.
And this inversion, and interestingly enough, inversion is there's a lot of truth in the old etymology. If you want to learn a lot, look up the definition of words. That we saw that it's easy to defeat the people that talk about civic nationalism because we just look up the root of the word nation,
right.
natus.
Right.
In the same way, inversion used to be the technical term for homosexuality.
Interesting.
And inversion is the core of deceptive rhetoric. They always literally call evil good and good evil.
Yep.
And so in this Orville episode, it was interesting because they have this race of, it's basically a homosexual race. They're all men. And then this guy had committed the horrible crime of being attracted to a woman. And so he ends up being outed, and they all, do their posturing about how bigoted the society is and that sort of thing. And so what was interesting is that they were obviously trying to attack those who consider homosexuality to be immoral, but they were doing it by inverting the relationship. And so, you see this inversion all the time. It's in your face with the whole transgender movement. And what it ultimately comes down to is calling good evil and evil good.
Yeah, like tolerance is intolerance. Abortion is feminine. Like when they say that abortion is women's health, like that's an inversion. Or like so many of these things, hate is love, love is hate. And they can't stop. That's the thing, is it eats them alive. Like at first you're like, what are these guys? These guys are, and then you're like, oh, they don't even know what's true anymore. Because once you enter that inversion, you're your own you're your own prison keeper too. It's like you can't win in that game. You get, that's why I am trying to not be sarcastic, and I used to love sarcasm because I sometimes find myself just saying the opposite of shit too much.
Right. No, I think that's a great policy to have. In fact, I've tried to start adopting that myself as well, just because I don't think that it helps communicate. I think that there's, like you said, that there's just something smirking and dishonest and superior about it, that there's just really no good reason for it.
Yeah.
And
yeah. It's also like there's something submission-y about it, where it's just like, it's almost like a way to deal with something that you won't fight head on, where you're like, great, I guess this is, like Ben Shapiro is the king of it, where it's just like, the media is great. I mean, this is awesome. I mean, I guess we're just going to kill all the kids. I mean, and you're like, no, say what's true, and then other people can rally behind that, It's almost like this weird communist style acceptance of misery. And satire is different. You can be satirical, like there's a lot of great satire, but sarcasm is a very specific thing that I don't think is very good for people.
Yeah, I mean, I love good satire.
Yeah.
You were mentioning the Promethean earlier, and that is hilariously funny, but The Missionaries by the same author is just off the freaking charts. I mean,
I love how much you love that book, man. I can't wait to read it, because like the way you describe it, you're like, this is the funniest thing you'll ever read. And I know that you don't blow smoke, so I'm going to read that because I'm excited to read the funniest thing I've ever read.
I decided to publish that book before I finished the first page. That's how good it is. And I found myself laughing out loud before the end of the first chapter. And I do not laugh out loud when I read, as a general rule.
Right.
And so, and the other thing is that because it's written, some of it was written 30 years ago.
Yeah.
It has this old school Evelyn Waugh literary sensibility to it that just doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
And so the whole thing that's incredible about it is that it is the least politically correct book that has been published in probably 20 years. And It was funny because one of the last media interviews I did before I stopped talking to the media was with a woman named Amanda Robb, she was planning to do a piece on Castalia House, our publishing company, and she wanted to know, like, oh, what's the best stuff you guys have done? So I said, okay, you need to read The Missionaries and you need to read Awake in the Nightland. Two great books, very, very different. And so during the interview, I said, so did you read The Missionaries? And she couldn't help herself. She actually inadvertently laughed. Just the question about it made her laugh. And she says, that was the most racist, offensive book I've ever read. And then she started laughing again. She goes, but oh my gosh, it's so funny.
That's great.
I mean, even SJWs she couldn't even bring herself to seriously condemn it. And it is so wildly politically incorrect. After you read it, you will be, I can't believe that this book was written, let alone published. I've been talking to this movie director, and because we're working on getting into that area as well at some point in the future. And I was talking to this director, and he said, I got to tell you, it is my dream to one day film The Missionaries. He's like, it would cause Hollywood to literally melt down.
I think that could be the final blow, and we can kick over the paper tiger.
Oh, it would, if we were to, I can say this right now, if we were to make a Missionaries movie and it was a big hit, Hollywood would never recover.
Just being crazy non-politically correct is infinitely less offensive to me than being like this sterile liar PC vampire, and they just keep shoving that in our face.
Well, the best thing about it is that it's absolutely true.
Right.
I mean, it's satire, it's exaggerated, but it's absolutely true. And I have to admit, I mean, I knew it was realistic. I know the author. I know he knows his stuff like better than anyone would believe. But I read an article about Papua New Guinea.
Yeah.
And I just started laughing because as horrific as the stuff he discusses in the book is, the reality is actually worse.
Yeah.
In terms of, I mean, I'm not giving anything away to say that at one point there's a trial, and somebody is put on trial, but he doesn't understand the whole Western concept of not being proud of having, slaughtered your enemies.
Right. That's hysterical.
And so the defense attorney keeps trying to like spin his acts, and the guy is getting angry because he's proud of what he's done.
Right.
He's a great warrior, and how can somebody try to take this away from him? And the total despair on the part of the SJWs who are trying to like make excuses for him. I mean, the juxtaposition is just brilliant.
It's so fun. Yeah, it's like one time I dated this girl, and she was insanely dumb, but I at the time thought that she was just really funny. And it took me a while to understand that. Like, someone would be like, hey, Tara, who's vice president? She'd be like, of the world? And I'd be like, I'm like, she's so funny. I mean, who would? And then finally, like, my buddies almost had like an intervention, and the linchpin was like, she thought there was a T in pizza. And I'm like, maybe she never saw a sign. And they're like, there's signs all over town. I'm like,
everywhere.
I know. I'm like, maybe not her town. They're like, all towns. And at that point, I realized that's almost like how SJWs can see some of these groups of people. I remember I had a professor in college, and he was like, I was working in this sub-Saharan African village, and they're so open-minded that they didn't have a word for Down syndrome. And now I'm like, yeah, because the average IQ is 60. Like there's no difference, right. But like they'll like take those things and be like, they're so like open. They're so they're in a different world. It's just a different culture. I'm like, they eat their own shit. You know, like there's people that are literally, they eat something called mud cookies in like Haiti. It's like, how is that like multiculturalism? That's insanely stupid.
Well, one of the reasons why I stopped talking to the media was Wired magazine did an interview with me. And I thought, I made the mistake of thinking that they were, going to actually give me a fair shake, because the reporter actually did go to the trouble of reading SJW's Always Lie before it was published. She was interested. I sent it to her. She actually had some interesting questions about it and then made no reference to it. She actually read the entire book, talked to me for an hour and a half about it, and then didn't even mention it or quote it once in the article, despite the fact that it was relevant.
Wizards.
But what she did focus on, because all she was looking for, of course, was the kill shot, the rhetorical kill shot to disqualify me. And what she landed on, and it actually did cause me some trouble with people at Breitbart. In fact, Milo was kind enough to step in and explain to people, like, no, Vox is not just being like mindlessly racist here.
Right.
But I was pointing out that different civilizations and different nations cannot coexist equally because they have different fundamental assumptions and abilities and customs.
Right.
And she said, well, give me an example. I said, well, like using the toilet. And she's like, what are you talking about? I said, well, a lot of the people that have come to Europe in the last 2 or 3 years, they don't use the toilets correctly. They literally stand on top of the toilet when the seat is down and defecate on the toilet lid.
Right.
And she's like, she writes about this as if I'm racist. And the thing is that in Italy and in Germany and in Switzerland, in a lot of the bathrooms, they actually have signs up basically with a person squatting on top of the thing and a big red circle and X through it, because they have to tell them this.
Right. It's like,
don't do that.
And this whole like different but equal thing, it's like, no, it's not. No, they're shitting all over the floor. Is not different but equal. It's not like, you like your song, I like my song. It's like, that's disgusting.
Well, it's also like, I would like to not catch typhus.
Right.
We would like not to spread dysentery throughout the entire city. And the thing that a lot of people don't understand is that cities are the result of civilization. Civilization is the art of allowing a lot of people to live in cities without dying like flies. And so what we're seeing in San Francisco, where they have literally tons of human waste on the streets every day, what we're seeing in Paris, what we're seeing in a lot of these cities is actually the retreat of civilization.
Right.
And so it's not a joke. It's not about racism. And that's what I tell people. I said, eventually people are going to have to understand that they're not choosing between, tolerance and civil rights and all this kind of stuff. What they're choosing between is, do you want flush toilets and the ability to live in cities to the age of 70? Or do you want to be running for your life from people that are trying to eat you?
Right. Yeah, it's like those
are the two choices.
There's no Eiffel Tower if everybody spends all day avoiding gang rape and cleaning shit.
Well, it's gang rape and cleaning shit. Forget that. I mean, they're going to need to be avoiding being spit roasted over an open fire. I mean, I don't think that most people in the West don't understand what life is like in the global East and South. They don't understand, for example, if you haven't read Chinese history, then you cannot understand how intrinsically brutal Chinese culture is. They have this, I've been reading a series called Outlaws of the Marsh. It's one of the two great literary classics of Chinese literature. And an ongoing theme is that the Gallant Brotherhood, the heroes of the Gallant Brotherhood, the outlaws, of the mountains and the marsh and stuff. They're constantly going around just killing men, women. I mean, somebody insults them, and so the guy like goes off and like slaughters 5 people and then has to leave town. Or the police will arrest someone, and because they know he didn't do it, they only brand his face and beat him for 7 days. And they're like, we're going easy on him because we know he didn't do it. But, because we arrested him, we have to go through the motion of beating the crap out of him for a week, and then we'll brand his face, and then we'll let him go.
That's hysterical. Yeah, and like one of the funniest things to come from it is these new Muslim Congress people are the only ones that call out Israel and Jews. And it's such a funny like realization for the left. Like the left is like, do not be Islamophobic. These people, yes, you have a pen and they have a machete, and it's the same thing. And then as soon as they're like, yeah, what's going on with the Jews? And they're like, wait, what? And they're like, oh shit. And then you just see the whole, there's so, like everyone for like the media freaked out. It's the first time I've ever seen a Muslim criticized in America was when that Congress lady was like, no, we get to fucking boycott Israel. And they're like, go back to the marrying the brothers, the machetes. And I couldn't stop laughing because as soon as they cross one of these lines that doesn't work for the power structure, they finally, it's not all the shitting and the gang rape and the eating bodies and the, it's just being like, what's up with the Jews? And then they just spiral.
Well, on a larger level, we're actually at a very interesting point in history, in Western history right now, because what we're seeing in both Britain and the United States is we're seeing the breakdown of Jewish political influence. And because what happened is both in England, starting with Disraeli, and in the United States, starting in the 1920s, the Jewish community did what they do. They bond together, they build each other up, and they managed to achieve a considerable amount of political influence. But of course, they've always got the fundamental problem that no matter how much money or media power or whatever they happen to get, they don't have numbers.
Right.
And, there's a great scene in A Game of Thrones, both the book and the TV show, where Queen Cersei demonstrates to Littlefinger the difference between power and influence.
Yep.
And so, in that situation, Littlefinger is kind of in the position of AI pack and everything. They have a tremendous amount of influence, and yet that influence can be wiped out overnight at will. And so, so it's this precarious situation, right? But what's happening and what's interesting, and it's further progressed in England than it has in the United States. But historically, the British Labour Party has been where the Jewish influence has been stronger. And now, because of all of they call them Asians. We would usually say Arabs, but they're from Pakistan, they're from Bangladesh and so forth. Now there's so many Asians in Britain, and they're such an important part of the Labour Party that the Jews have left. 7 of them. I'm not sure if all 7 are Jewish, but they actually left the Labour Party because they say that the Labour Party is too anti-Semitic. And then also a number of, I think 3 Tories and possibly 2 more have left. And so what we're seeing the same thing in the United States with Never Trump. What Never Trump actually is it's actually the neocons, which are the Jewish Trotskyites who joined the Republican Party because they oppose the Russians in the Soviet Union. And now they've been sort of, they've taken themselves out of the Republican Party. And what you're seeing now on the Democratic side is the same thing that we've seen in the Labour Party, where the immigrants who were brought in to provide numbers against the native interests now want their own voice. They want their own representatives. And the reason that I'm so aware of this is because, I grew up in Minnesota, and Minneapolis has always been a heavy Democratic. I mean, Minnesota is the most liberal state in the U.S. and Minneapolis is like the heart of it's the left of the left of the left.
Right.
And so there was this, I think, 17-term state representative, a Jewish woman who had represented the district where the Somalis all are. And the woman who is now the representative that you're talking about, before she became the state representative, she was the local rep, and she beat that Jewish woman very easily because all of the Somalis supported her.
Right.
And they weren't interested in being represented by this Jewish woman who talked a good game and talked about how much she supported the Somalis against the interests of the native, whites, blah, blah, blah. They wanted their own. And now the Hispanics are beginning to become more conscious, and they want to represent themselves. They don't want to be represented by some other group. And the really interesting thing is now the Asian populations, I mean, in the American sense, the Chinese population wants to be represented by Chinese representatives and so forth. And so what you're seeing is the gradual diminution of the Jewish influence in the Democratic Party.
Yeah, because so much of it, I think, is based on the premise that they can control people with free money, and they like needy populations. And then they're like, all right, here's free money, do that. And they don't understand that there's certain groups in the world that quickly are not as sold by that, where they're like, you bring in a bunch of Somalians and you're like, well, here's free healthcare. Hey, just don't ask any questions. And they're like, you are Jew sodomite. And they're like, what? And they're like, we need to kill you or else we don't get goat. And they're like, what the fuck? And then they realize the whole thing's falling apart. Like the sticks, the carrots and sticks don't work with certain populations. And that's when they're like, yeah, it's like this one New York Times guy followed me around for a bit and like went to a show and was going to write an article on me. And it was probably very similar to what happened with you, where they're just looking for that rhetorical kill shot. And I think over time, he never wrote the article because he realized I was almost like that Papua New Guinea guy where I was proud of it. Where he like right. if you that's probably one thing that happens with comedians. It might be different for non-comedians, but if you try to like write it out, it's it's like Owen Benjamin is a racist. He has a song called "That Nigger Stole My." Black people would read that and be like, that's hilarious. And I'd be like, do you not get the joke? And he'd be like, I can't use shame against this guy. And it just kind of really, it's kind of hard to stick somebody that's like, oh no, that's funny though. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, first of all, I think there's two reasons. Number one, because it is funny, that does, anything that you say, as long as it's funny, that does tend to make it okay in a way.
Right.
But the other thing that's important is that the best humor is based on truth.
Right.
And so even though you're saying something that is deemed off limits, the fact that it's based on truth is what makes it so funny. Aristotle specifically says the most effective rhetoric is based on the truth. The more that your rhetoric, there is no information content in rhetoric.
Right.
It's all about persuasion and affecting the emotions and stuff. But the more that